Imagine, imagine you're a former slave,
Yeah.
finally free after the Civil War.
Yeah.
But then you get tricked into signing like a contract you can't even read
Oh, wow.
and end up working right alongside convicts
Okay.
for like a whole decade.
I can't even.
That was the reality, I mean, for a lot of black Southerners in the so-called New South.
Yeah.
And we're diving into all these sources you gave us. A great mix, by the way. Court cases, firsthand accounts,
Yep.
even speeches from this era
Huh?
to understand like how this period differed from like the pre-Civil War South and the rise of Jim Crow and you know the whole struggle for equality.
Yeah, it's a fascinating period, really, and complex, often gets overshadowed, I think, by the Civil War itself.
Yeah.
The term New South, it was more than just a slogan. They really, really wanted to reshape the South economically and socially.
Right.
But as we're going to see, those changes often came at a steep price for Black Americans.
Yeah, let's unpack that. This
Sure.
this New South. Your sources show like rapid industrialization, cotton mills like springing up left and right, huge demand for labor.
Right.
But this kind of led to some unsettling, you know, parallels with like the industrialized North, right?
Absolutely. Child labor, for instance, became a huge issue in these southern factories. You know that source about Fanny, the 9-year-old,
Right.
working in a South Carolina cotton mill?
Oh yeah.
Her own grandfather gave her like $2 bills, you
Yeah.
know, to buy pretty dresses to wear at the mill.
Oh wow.
It's just heartbreaking. And it makes you wonder, were there any Southern voices at the time that challenged this? Or did the push for progress just kind of drown them out?
Yeah, progress isn't always a straight line, that's for sure. And it wasn't just factories. Sharecropping, like a system designed to replace slavery, right?
Right.
Often ended up trapping black families in a cycle of debt.
Right.
We have Baby's story.
Yeah.
He was a sharecropper and unknowingly signed this contract, bound him to forced labor like for 10 years because he couldn't even read.
Yeah. Baby's story is a powerful one.
Mm,
Really illustrates how this economic exploitation was just able to thrive. He didn't understand the fine print, you know, so the owner could basically imprison him if he tried to leave.
right.
This whole system of debt peonage where you're forced to work to pay off this debt, it was practically slavery by another name.
Yeah, I mean, working alongside convicts for years
Mhm.
really blurs the lines, huh? Between freedom and captivity in this New South.
Yeah.
It's striking though that even with these conditions, there was still resistance. You had that information about sugar plantation workers in Louisiana. They joined the Knights of Labor, went on strike for better wages, better working conditions.
Yeah, the Thibodeau Massacre, 1887, that came from that strike, that's a pivotal event, I think, shows that the fight for labor rights wasn't just a northern thing. Black workers in the South, they were organizing, but the violent response, you know, from the white authorities just solidified white control and really stifled unionization in the South for decades.
We're seeing this mix, right, of economic forces, the legacy of slavery, the emergence of organized resistance.
Oh,
All this happening as Jim Crow laws are like systematically designed to segregate black Americans.
really?
And the Louisiana Separate Car Act, 1890, right, mandating separate train cars for black and white passengers. That's like a prime example of this.
Yeah, that law is key, actually, because it's the one Homer Plessy challenged, led to the whole Plessy v. Ferguson case, which we'll get into. But before we do that, we should acknowledge the passing of a major figure in all this. Frederick Douglass died in 1895. Big loss for civil rights.
End of an era for sure.
Yep.
It's shocking how even in death, you know, he faced racism.
Yeah.
One of the sources, North Carolina newspaper, condemned his interracial marriage, called him an enemy to both races.
Yeah.
Just a stark reminder of, you know, how deeply ingrained that prejudice was.
Yeah, I mean, that reaction to Douglass's marriage, it speaks volumes, right, about the anxieties around racial mixing. That fueled so much of Jim Crow. And as we move into the late 1890s, we see this prejudice becoming law in even more, well, insidious ways through disenfranchisement. Southern states like South Carolina started adopting new constitutions, literacy tests, poll taxes, effectively taking away the vote from countless black citizens.
And these measures, they were clearly targeting black voters, right?
Right.
While still protecting white folks who couldn't read,
Mm-hmm.
you know, through these clauses about Confederate service and whatnot.
Exactly.
Seems like a pretty blatant attempt to just undo all the progress of Reconstruction.
Yeah, absolutely.
You included a really powerful speech from Robert Smalls. He was a black delegate to the South Carolina Constitutional Convention. And he just rails against these very measures.
Yeah, Smalls, he's essential reading, I think. If you want to understand the courage of black leaders during this time, I mean, he didn't hold back at all,
Yeah.
calling out the injustice of these laws, even though, his voice was basically drowned out by the whole white supremacy thing going on.
Yeah.
And this ties right into Plessy v. Ferguson, because without the right to vote, legal challenges like Plessy's case became even more crucial.
So Plessy v. Ferguson, right. The case that basically cemented separate but equal
Yeah.
into American society. I mean, for decades.
Yeah.
It's become kind of infamous, hasn't it?
Yeah, it's a case that's resonated for all the wrong reasons, unfortunately. It's interesting, to trace how this case, starting with Plessy's arrest, made its way all the way to the Supreme Court. There was this group, the Citizens Committee. They were Creoles in New Orleans, and they basically orchestrated this act of civil disobedience very carefully.
Wow.
They specifically chose Homer Plessy, who could actually pass for white, to challenge this separate car act head on. It was like a brilliant strategy, really, to show how absurd these laws were.
Yeah, they knew what they were doing.
Yeah.
But in the end, I mean, the court didn't see it that way, right? Can
Yeah.
you talk about their reasoning and maybe what the social attitudes were back then that might have influenced this decision?
Sure. I mean, the 7-1 ruling, right, in favor of separate but equal, it was just devastating. It basically legalized segregation for the next 50 years.
Wow.
Justice Henry Brown, he wrote for the majority. He argued that, separation didn't automatically mean inferiority. And he even suggested that, if black people felt inferior because of these laws, it was their own perception, not, the intent of the law itself. And this ruling, it really reflects the thinking at the time, the scientific and social thought often relied on these kind of bogus scientific ideas about race to justify segregation.
Yeah, it's really hard to wrap your head around that logic now, from today's perspective.
Right.
But there was one good thing, right? A glimmer of hope, at least. Justice John Harlan's dissent.
Yes.
He stood alone, arguing that separate is inherently unequal, and that the Constitution, is colorblind.
Powerful words.
Incredibly powerful, especially knowing, that they'd eventually help overturn separate but equal in Brown v. Board of Education.
Yeah, Harlan's dissent is it's a great example of principled opposition, even when you're facing, overwhelming odds. He saw the prejudice at the heart of these laws. The majority just refused to acknowledge it. His words, they're a testament to the long and difficult fight for progress.
Yeah, and speaking of journeys, Baby Story, the sharecropper, it really shows the lasting damage of this whole era. He was eventually released from forced labor.
Right.
But not before his wife was coerced into a relationship with one of the guards. And he lost contact with his son. Just heartbreaking. Really shows the personal tragedies, that happen within these systems.
Yeah, it's so important to remember that these weren't just legal battles. Real lives were affected by these laws and practices. Baby's story, it reminds us of the human cost of Jim Crow and this whole idea of the New South.
It's easy to feel kind of overwhelmed,
Yeah.
looking back on this period. The injustices, the setbacks. But as we talked about, there were these seeds of resistance being planted.
Yeah, we talked about the Citizens Committee, the ones that set up Plessy's case, and black delegates like Robert Smalls, who bravely spoke out against being denied the right to vote.
Right.
I mean, those were acts of real defiance. They laid the groundwork for the whole civil rights movement of the 20th century.
Right.
They refused to accept things the way they were. Their courage it's pretty inspiring. What's really interesting to me is how this era, it still kind of echoes in today's issues. We see traces of separate but equal in debates about education, healthcare, even the internet. And the fight for voting rights. I mean, that's still going on today.
Yeah, it feels like history isn't just about the past, right? It's about understanding where we are now and how we shape the future. Looking at all these sources, I mean, the court cases, the personal stories, the speeches, what really stands out to you? Is there a specific detail or story that you keep coming back to?
For me, it's the story of Homer Plessy and that Citizens Committee. They were so deliberate in defying that separate car act. It shows that even with all that pressure, legal and social, people were still willing to fight for what they believed in.
Yeah.
They planted a seed, that grew into the whole civil rights movement. It's a good reminder that change is possible, even when it seems impossible.
It really does speak to the power of collective action, I think. The Citizens Committee, it wasn't just one person, right?
Right.
It was a whole group. united against injustice.
Yeah.
That's something, we can all strive for in our own communities,
Mm-hmm.
in our own ways.
It makes you wonder, though, how can we really learn from this to make sure everyone has true equality? How can we be more like them? The Citizens Committee, Robert Smalls, even Justice Harlan, people who stood up for what's right even when it wasn't popular.
Those are good questions we should all be asking. And I think it starts with education, right? Understanding, all this complex history, the struggles, the victories.
Yeah.
The more we know about the past, the better we can build the future.
Maybe if we really, really wrestle with the legacy of Jim Crow and the New South, maybe then we can finally move past separate but equal and build a society where everyone has a chance to thrive, no matter their race or background.
That's a powerful thought. And looking back at everything we've talked about, I'm struck by the resilience of those who fought for equality. It makes you wonder about the parallels to what's going on today. What can we learn from their tactics, their persistence? Well, thank you for taking this deep dive with us. We really encourage you to keep exploring these topics and think about how this history shapes our world today.